In a world full of distractions, there is one big question on every dog owner's lips.
How do I become more than just the person holding the other end of the leash?
We all get dogs with a dream in mind, a vision of the future. And if right now your everyday reality isn't quite that picture you had in mind, you are in the right place.
It really doesn't have to be this way.
You absolutely can and will be more to your dog than just the person who gets in between them and the world.
The key is you need to be more sexy.
More sexy than the neighbourhood cat.
More sexy than the jogger in the park.
More sexy than that half-eaten hamburger they just found on the floor.
And yes, even more sexy than the dog across the road.
I'm Tom.
And I'm Lauren.
Together we're Absolute Dogs.
And you're listening to the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast.
Hello and welcome to this episode of the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast, the podcast that effectively teaches you how to overcome struggles that you're facing with your dog through the power of 3-minute games.
So today we tackle a topic that I think is actually very close to many people, and it's something that really it can't be necessarily avoided, and actually it really makes a difference for a harmonious family, and that is dealing with children and dogs and how they can harmoniously live together or not. Absolutely. As the case may be, right?
And there's all that advice out there about how you should probably not mix or work with the two, especially not at the same time. But the reality is that some of us cannot actually avoid that. So what we wanted to talk about was really what are the game-changing pillars of success when it comes to having either a single dog or multi-dog household coupled with tiny people.
And I can definitely tell this story from the heart. I know that when I first found out that I was having a baby, I think the first thought that came into my head is, oh my gosh, how are the dogs going to cope with this? Like, it wasn't how will I cope with this? How will Matt cope with this? This is my babies and a new baby. Like, how does this work? And actually, it's kind of like a jigsaw puzzle at first because there's a lot of different moving parts. And I think that's probably the biggest thing to take into consideration here, right, Tom? How many moving parts there are. And actually, these novelty, I mean, we've called them before novelty machines, haven't we? Babies.
Babies and children, they do a lot of crazy novel things. And as we've talked about before in previous episodes of the podcast, some of our dogs, they might be a little bit on the pessimistic side in that they might see novelty or new things as something to worry about rather than to be cool about.
I'll give you a little example of that. It was Halloween sort of evening. I remember with Liza, past event, and I remember that she went downstairs. About 10 minutes later, she ran upstairs in full on like Halloween gear. I think she was something from what's it called? It's the Mexican something of the Dead. I can't remember, Night of the Dead or something like that. She basically ran up. She was in this like Day of the Dead gear, black lipstick, which I don't know where on earth she managed to find that. It certainly wasn't any of mine. And she literally just appeared. And I remember in that moment thinking, dear Lord, like what on earth is going on here? And yet the dogs were all quite cool with it. But at the same time, those are sorts of moments that can really throw pessimism or challenge our dog's optimism, let's say. And also they're moments that I suppose we need to be at least prepared for or ready for, whether you either have children of your own or even sometimes more difficult for dogs where actually they don't see children regularly or they don't live with children or they're not used to seeing children, and then actually they just appear in their life or in their day. So I think it's something to consider, right?
Absolutely. And so it kind of leads on to what is the first pillar of success when it comes to, dogs and children cohabiting, and that is that actually every dog has a bucket, as we've talked about in the past, and things pay into that bucket throughout the day. There might be scary things, there might be exciting things, there might just be the day-to-day happenings of a household. Now, the thing is that if dogs and children are together all the time and for a lot of the time, well, you can bet that bucket's going to get more and more full because, well, children are busy, babies are busy, they do crazy things, they are novelty machines. And so what we're saying is that actually the secret to a successful relationship between dogs and children is for them not to be together all the time. And actively what we talk about and what we employ in our own households is a gated community where...
And that gated community, a lot of people, they think it must be about like dogs and the dogs having an area. Actually, I've used it forever for Eliza with gates and stairs, and actually the dogs became part of that gated community, but actually it's as important for our children as it is for our dogs. And I'm not saying, don't get us wrong here, we're not saying that you keep children behind gates or in crates. That is absolutely not what we're saying. However, what we are saying is there are certainly boundaries in the house, and there are presence doesn't mean effectively access, right? And those areas, for example, last night Liza was eating her dinner, and our dogs were on the boundaries, and they were on the raised boundaries, and those are just part of that presence doesn't mean access sort of scenario and picture. And actually it's none of their business a lot of the time.
Exactly. And what that allows our dogs to do is effectively for their buckets to empty without further contributions from other members of the household. And the key here is that actually dogs, they're a species that they live in family groups anyway. They are domesticated, so they absolutely adore humans and they want to cohabit with humans and be around humans. But we all know those relationships or those scenarios or those people where you really like this person. Let's say you've met them once, you really like them. And then you think that they're great, and this person says, you know what, let's spend the weekend together, or let's spend a week together. And you spend that weekend or that week together, and you hit that point where actually you're like, you know what, I'm not enjoying this anymore.
I've had enough of this company.
I need to empty my bucket a little bit because this person's contributing a lot to my bucket. And I see this a lot, from a vet behavior perspective, where dogs have, to be honest, like dogs maybe have even bitten children and bitten babies and whatever else. And the reality is that dog was actually doing really well. They just reached the point of their bucket overflowing because of constant exposure.
And let's address that point very briefly here, I think, because it's definitely worth addressing, is that the relationship between children and dogs is definitely a complex one. It's one that needs to be monitored. I was working with the police only recently, and they've had some horrific cases and some horrific incidents, which certainly wouldn't be something I wanted to share or go into. And yet at the same time, that I think we have to be mindful of. And so I think dogs and children, let's put it out there now, that they require supervision, they require careful management, they require us on a very serious note, never taking those relationships for granted and always acknowledging them when we own dogs, whether that be Blink, who's the cutest Cocker Spaniel in the world, potentially, other than Ketone, who's also obviously the cutest. But equally, I mean, I know that even within our own dog households, like we've had to grow them, we've had to supervise them, we've had to nurture them. They're not relationships that necessarily would have always
natural. Right?
Let's go with Bet and Eliza, because this is funny. So Bet's never grown up with children, and yet she kind of has always been around Eliza when she's here. Right. And let's go with the choices and how these are made, because it's funny.
The funny thing is that Bet, as you probably all know, she's very full on. She's like the Rambo of the dog world. She's like a bulldozer. She's incredibly gritty. Puts her all into everything. And so you can imagine that kind of what is, she's a 13 kilogram border collie, but when she moves,
is a bull.
She's like a bull.
Let's put her 60 kilos when she puts some momentum behind her.
And you pair that with a little person, a small person who maybe wants to maybe do exciting things with that dog. You can imagine that combination might be a challenge. And yet through the skills that we talk about throughout this podcast, what you find is that actually Eliza and Bet are like best friends. And in fact, Eliza now, if she has a choice of who she gets to walk, she would walk Bet.
And the funniest thing is, Tom and I both looking and going, well, Bet's the full-on one. Like, it's not. We'll quite happily hand her over for anyone else to walk, because she like challenges you. Yeah. And yet Eliza and her walk hand in hand almost, or paw in hand, and they just trot along, don't they, merrily?
Totally fine, like absolutely fine. So I guess, guys, what we're saying as well is that often, if we're thinking about supervision, we've got to account for the fact that actually some days you're going to be tired, some days you're going to kind of want to switch off and relax, and that isn't conducive to smart supervision of dogs and children together. And so what a gated community does, and that opportunity to actually say, it's good for my dog to not be part of the action all the time, that allows you to actually make great choices and think, well, you know what, I'm feeling tired, I've had a bucket filling day myself, let's do gated community right now, let's not have have them together.
It's almost a pressure release for you. It's almost a
permission to take the pressure off, right?
And that permission is a real relief for so many of us. And I think it's, like I said, just revisiting very quickly that whole police scenario, working with them and talking through some of the cases that they've been involved in, because obviously dangerous dogs are something that they deal with on a day-to-day basis and going into buildings and properties with dangerous dogs. But actually some of the dangerous dogs they are put into the position that these things almost, they can't not happen.
Is it dangerous dog or is it bucket overflowing dog?
And how we manage that bucket, and actually the owner having that huge responsibility, which is owning a dog, right? Like it's a big responsibility, and supervision is so big. So yeah, absolutely huge in terms of just acknowledging our role in this and acknowledging who we are and what role we play to safeguard this relationship.
So next pillar of success is actually, weirdly, the key foundation to a dog and child getting on well is that each of them understand this concept of disengaging from the other. And so we can only, we're going to focus on dog training in this podcast, but there's similar lessons that need to be learned from the children's perspective.
Equally, I think the children and parents, whether it's in the same family as the dog or not, I think that's a huge responsibility. I was walking only yesterday. I was up on the moors. It was a beautiful, beautiful day. And as we were coming around the corner, I had 4 dogs with me, and there was a little girl, and her mum said, "Careful, careful," and she walked past the dog and she looked into Abra's eyes and she said, "Careful, careful," and she said, no, I didn't mean the dog, I meant you. And her little daughter was so cute, really, really cute little girl called Katie, and she said, "No, you, Katie." And Katie was like smiling, going, "Careful, careful," to Abra. And I think it's those moments of realization that we take a good part of that responsibility as parents of children, and actually acknowledging our role in that. As much as we're not here training children, I think parents, yes, we could potentially help. So I think it is definitely something to be acknowledged. At the same time, like you said, dog training, disengagement being the number one thing we're talking about.
Exactly. And I think that one of the big misconceptions with children and dogs is we think that the relationship should be about engagement and interaction, when really the foundation of a great relationship is, first of all, can you just be in the same room as each other and not be totally engaged and totally obsessed and like only see interaction as the only option there? And so what we do with especially our young dogs or new dogs to the household, what we think about is actually in those times where you're wanting to promote just disengagement and everybody doing their own thing, well, maybe we need to manage that dog in that setting, and maybe they just need to be on lead while they're learning these skills. Maybe we need to be dropping their daily food allowance at our feet with them on lead, and them seeing value in actually not interacting with the baby or the toddler or the child or whatever, really whatever age that it might be. From that foundation, then we can work on creating a great relationship between the two. But the reality is that first and foremost, what we need to do is we need to teach them that there's value in just ignoring each other as well.
And I was walking a dog only recently. It was a dog that was staying for training, and very, very quickly acknowledged, Tom, that whenever I went out, that dog would not stop going to look for other people and other things and what I said to Matt, and we were out walking with our dogs and we brought her along with us, I really said, this is exactly where people struggle. She's learned so much of everyone is fun and everyone is accessible. Actually, this isn't a good foundation to build on. And what we need to do is take her away from the situation, not keep allowing her to rehearse it. Because actually, every time she rehearses this going up and visitation right on everyone. So it is kind of it's that first point of presence doesn't mean access on top of disengagement, because those two build together to be what we have with our dogs when we walk, and they actually don't need to rush up and see children. And that's the worry, is that sometimes when they do rush up to see children and they're not sure about what that child actually means, that's when you can have an incident, right? Yeah,
absolutely. And so I guess this leads nicely on to, well, where does the child come into this in terms of is there an approach that we can take with the little people that might actually help that dog out in disengaging? And so the key is what we found, and this actually secret, guys, don't tell anybody this applies to all family members. children and adult alike.
Adults alike. Warning, adults.
Yeah. So this is how we have a harmonious household. So the key is that often you can think about all the different things that you wouldn't want somebody to do with your dog, that might encourage bad behavior, that might encourage engagement, that might get them excited. And we've all got those family members, whether they're children or adult. To be honest, I think both can be equally as dangerous, where they actively always do the thing that that really doesn't help that dog out, that they really don't need, where they really kind of encourage excitement.
And they're like, I saw exactly this happen the other day with a family I was observing, and they literally started to do this all over the dog, and the dog wheezed everywhere as well. So it wasn't even like the whole scenario was, and they said, oh yeah, he does that when you're always paying attention to him like this. And I'm thinking, this is exactly the scenario, right? Where the family member rushes on the pup or the dog. And that's the outcome of that experience. Exactly.
And so what we do is we have an approach of, sure, we can think of the million different things that we don't want somebody to do with our dog.
Because there are many.
How about we think about one thing that we do want them to do? And how about we make it their job to do that? So, for example, it could be that their job is, while ever the dog is lying on their boundary or on their bed, that they take a bit of their daily food allowance and throw it on their bed towards them. That could be one of their job. Or if it's an older family member, it might be, for example, hey, do you want to actually, I'm trying to promote calmness here. I see that you really want to interact with him. Do you want to take the lead and drop food at your feet? Because I think he'd actually really enjoy that experience.
And it could be as simple as keep 4 feet on the floor, which if you've ever owned a springy type dog, something that's bouncy and wants to get their feet off the floor. I own Cocker Spaniels, so you know what, we know this breed. So for me, it could be just 4 feet on the floor. So 4 feet on the floor, you can drop food. Yeah. So you can give them a job. The other thing I found really, really useful in our multi-dog and person household is actually grounding people. Yeah. So giving them a job like, okay, you guys sit there, I'll go grab you a drink. And for the minute, ignore the dog. I'm going to have some food pots available in a minute that you can play with and throw some food in. But actually, your number one role is, would you like a drink? Grab a seat. And I think when you've got the would you like a drink? Grab a seat, you actually ground the people. I know we had a meeting, didn't we? Not that long ago. We brought in people in suits into the house, which actually the dogs don't see. Those sorts of like, no. And this was a weird scenario of like a multi-people sort of team meet. And so actually, and they definitely don't see suits with us. No. And so it was literally ground them on a seat, give them a drink, and actually then we could manage the interactions.
Give them a location to occupy. I think the other thing, gosh, we can go on and on about this.
We can digress for sure.
Is that often people will pick the wrong, if you've got a multi-dog household, often people or children will pick the worst candidate for their interaction. Like
the fact that Eliza hones in on Bet every time.
Bet, who's like 150 miles an hour. And so the other strategy that you can do is you can direct them onto a more suitable candidate. So, for example, in my house, I've got little Ketone.
Perfect for Eliza. Perfect.
Tiny black spaniel, so sweet and gentle. And
easy on lead. Couldn't pull Eliza over if she tried.
No, absolutely. And so, for example, if Eliza was coming to visit and she saw Bet on a boundary, and I see her eyes meet Bet's eyes, and they both fill with energy, and you see which way it's going to go. I might say something like, "Hey, Eliza, do you want to have I'm training Ketone middle. Do you want to have a little go at playing middle with her?" And in turn, what you get is you get what you do want. You direct them appropriately. But I think if I said to Eliza in that moment, now Bet's really not the choice that I would make, and don't
Eliza
look at her. Don't look at her
even harder.
You can imagine the little glance that she might do when you're not looking.
It's the daredevil in her, especially because
creeping towards the bed.
We've built Eliza up to being able to work with Bet, and at the same time, I think it's a relationship that you grow, and I think that's the other thing. And I think it's worth mentioning here. It's small steps every day in the right direction, and not allowing it to overfill. So at no point have we said to Eliza, "Okay, let's go on like a 4-hour hike with Bet, and you can have her on lead the whole time, squealing and running." Or let's go on a cycle ride or something like that. It's always been like small interactions, and then it's always been good. And I think this is the thing, and again, God mustn't digress, but generally in dog training that I think we've learned over the last few years that just has made such a big difference in all of our dogs training is that actually small steps in the right way are so much better than a big exposure that goes wrong. And actually I'd much prefer to safeguard those exposures and not have anything go wrong than to allow them to keep presenting and have an issue.
The crazy thing is that the absence of anything going wrong, or the absence of rehearsing what we don't want, is actually depressingly, way more important than anything that
it's
you
so
can
powerful.
do.
So powerful. And so just not allowing those experiences to go wrong, like not allowing them. I mean, again, the shock for me about hearing things like children left unsupervised with a dog that isn't necessarily, I mean, to be honest, we just shouldn't. Like, we just shouldn't. There's no need for it. And when you hear those scenarios, you're thinking, well, actually, those situations are allowed to happen. The big thing is you don't want to be overprotective to the point that actually you don't enjoy your life. At the same time, I think protection, there is a place for like vigilance and protection.
Absolutely. So, and I guess the other thing, final thing on this point is that have you ever you've known two people, they didn't know each other, and you would really love it if you were all friends together. So you kind of organize to meet with these two other people, and you almost like try and matchmake them, and you're like, you see, you've got this in common, and they don't get on because we're forcing them to get on, right?
We're forcing the interaction, and when you're forcing the interaction, it just isn't necessarily where it's at.
Rushed, right? It's not the way to do it.
And not authentic either, right?
Absolutely.
Like it's pressured.
So I guess it leads on to the final pillar of what we wanted to share with you, and that is that every level, at every layer, at every interaction, what we need to do between dogs and children is inspire calmness.
Now, calmness isn't necessarily either of their first go-tos. No. Surely, like Liza, I watched and I'm like, wow, that calmness is like sometimes like the hidden switch. You can't actually find it, and you have to kind
it's
of
not the first choice.
Definitely not there. And the same for dogs like Blink and Bet, and to be honest, most of our dogs I'd say are high energy. We don't really have anything that's naturally laid back.
No.
And so for me, I think this is something that we're growing all the time, knowing that everything they choose is always appropriate. Yeah. And I love that whatever they choose from calmness, it's always appropriate. And so with children, it's even more appropriate. And actually, what I find is they match each other the more that you keep employing calmness. So the more that I employ calmness with Blink, the more that Eliza is calm around Blink.
And so the cool thing about this is that dogs are creatures of efficiency. So if they always do exciting things in a certain place, for example, imagine your dog walking to the dog park and how the excitement increases leading up to that off-lead opportunity. Or if they always do exciting things in the presence of somebody, they will be excited in the future because they're just like, I'm going to skip the middleman. I know that exciting things are going to happen. Here is excitement. Now, the cool thing is that we can flip that on its head, and we can say, if you rehearse calmness around your children, for example, by using your dog's daily food allowance to pay into that calmness bank account, and there's a whole episode of this podcast just on calmness that you can listen to and remind yourself of all the strategies that we use. What you get is a triggered calmness in the presence of children. And that's powerful.
Definitely what we're trying to grow every time, right? Like that's absolutely what we're looking for, is that actually they're not such a crazy event for each other. Like we talk all the time about non-event learning and non-event training. Like this for me is actually what I want it to become. It's not like something that triggers high arousal, fast movement, fast pace. Actually, this is something that is enjoyable and is calm and is at the right pace for both the dog and the child.
Absolutely. And so, I always say this kind of tongue in cheek, but it is take it literally as I say it. High arousal relationships don't last long. And it's true that
I think Tom has some secret experiences here that he's not willing to share on the podcast.
No, but the point is, guys, that if you've got a really like high excitement relationship between a dog and a person, what you find is that relationship, it doesn't last that long because it starts to break down.
Do you want to share your experience?
I don't want to share. There is no experience.
Did you see him? He nearly
to clarify,
fell into
there's
it.
no experience.
He nearly fell into
it. But the key here is that if we inspire low arousal, if we inspire calmness, if we inspire optimism, if we inspire disengagement, that's a long-lived happy relationship.
So one other point I didn't want to forget, and I don't necessarily think it's necessary just for here calmness, but generally dogs and people, children that are scared of dogs or children that are worried about dogs, there's a lot of people who also really feel that dogs and people and children have to be friends. I think here's the other thing that's really important and worth acknowledging here, and obviously you're welcome to share this podcast with absolutely anyone, right, Tom? Like we want you to share it with other dog trainers, friends, families that maybe are looking for a dog, like just to think through, because for me, children that are scared of dogs, this isn't something that we ever force, and actually all of these things can be done in a really gentle way where they don't need to face each other for a long time.
The
You
same
actually
principles apply.
Yeah, exactly that.
The same principles apply in that actually, how about we're just in each other's presence, disengaging from each other, being calm, being a non-event.
And learning to be happy coexisting and around each other. And you'd be surprised at how quickly those relationships become really happy ones.
Yeah.
At the same time, like we said earlier, they're never forced. And I think it's worth acknowledging that a lot of children are really scared of dogs. Actually, don't ever force that relationship.
Yeah.
Allow that relationship to nurture and grow without any pressure. And I think that dogs can give a huge amount to children's development. I remember working in a school a good few years back now when I was a school teacher and actually watching how much dogs can bring to the table to help enhance children's learning and children's development and children's confidence. At the same time, the children who are scared of dogs really don't need to be forced, and I bet they'll come on board anyway. They just need their time and their space. So just like Tom's saying, actually all of the principles above really apply in a slightly different way, but the same way at the same time, right?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I guess kind of a nice summary story at this point is telling you a little story about my niece, Lily, who goes and obviously my mum looks after her a lot and enjoys spending time with her. And my mum has a dog and he's called Luca. And the funny thing is that one of Lily's first words, she's like 15 months old, something like that. One of Lily's first words was actually down, because what she really loves doing is asking Luca to do a down, and he does his down, and then she throws a piece
So
of food
cute.
in his direction. So what happens is that whenever Lily's around, she's kind of been a crazy menace, and Luca's doing his down, because that, you know what? That's what he does in her presence. He's chilled about it. And she actually, what we've done is we've actually said, you know what, this is what we want you to do with Luca. We don't want you to pull his hair. We don't want you to ride him. We don't want you to do all these other things. What we want you to do
feed
is
him for a down.
ask for a down and then give him a bit of food. And she just laughs. She thinks it's hilarious. And I think Luca actually has now paired her laughter with food, and he thinks that laughter's cool and she's a novelty
Food,
machine, and
laughter,
he's fine with it.
Dog training, children. And I think that's the most lovely space to end on, is that the relationships can be so happy and so harmonious. It just takes a little bit of patience, vigilance,
Think
scanning
about
on
what
our
you do
part.
want.
And not over facing the situation at any point and not being silly about it. I think that's a biggie, is staying aware.
Yeah. So with that, guys, that was this episode of the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast. We think this is a really important one. So if you know someone with a child and or a dog, which is probably a lot of people that you know, then you probably need to share this podcast.
And take that as a gift that you can give. Take that as a gift that you can keep giving. It's a free podcast. It's a learning opportunity.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, learning is what keeps us all alive. So it's a great gift to give. So how does someone go about sharing it, Tom?
So the way that you can share it is by sharing the iTunes link or the Spotify link or the Google Podcast link or whatever, or you can head to absolutedogs.me/start. And the cool thing is if you send that link, and in fact you guys use this link as well if you like, you actually get a downloadable guide to get you up to speed with the podcast, so that literally you can have a quick read through of the guide, you can see some of the games, you can see some of the strategies in that guide. It's totally free, and then you can jump right into the podcast episode.
Whoa.
So that was this episode of the Sexier Than a Squirrel podcast. We will see you next week, and remember, stay sexy. Hey, before you go, have you taken part in the worldwide Sexier Than a Squirrel challenge?
It's a 25-day online video program. Huge energy, amazing community, and over 6,000 people are already taking part.
The only question is, you know where you are today. Where do you want to be 25 days from now? Head to absolutedogs.me/sexy.